I do want to use these 3 weeks, we'll be meeting the next 2 Wednesdays as well, to explore three themes of the teachings of Lahiri Mahasaya. We will start by looking at his life just a bit, and there are a lot of stories, of course, that we have from the autobiography of a yogi. But I was meditating on what is it that characterizes Lahiri Mahasaya's teachings. For all of us to whom he is a guru, of course, we take him in his entirety. But if you were to step back a little bit and just look at who this man was and what did he teach and what was the purpose of his life, what was he trying to demonstrate, I was trying to meditate on what would be the core essence of his teaching that I could communicate to anybody, not just disciples on this path. And there were three things that came to me, and it's not my own, this is just a structure, it's not an inspiration. And that's what we will use to go into the subject and tune into Lahiri Mahasaya these next 2 weeks, this week and the next 2 weeks. And all of this exploration, there is a lot of information, this book especially, which many of you may be aware of. This is a biography that is originally written in Bengali, and it was translated into English many decades ago, I think. But it was not as widely published or available until the last 10 years, especially in the West. Now you can purchase this even on Amazon here in the US. And very fascinating book. I wouldn't say it's easy to read. Sometimes there are pages without any paragraph breaks. I just wonder. I mean, easily he could have put a few paragraph breaks in there, which would make it easier to read. But anyway, there is a lot of things that are shared here. And as I was starting to say, there is a lot of depth and teachings and information available from the different disciples and the lineages that they've all brought to us through Lahiri Mahasaya. And of course, all of what we know and what we practice is through Paramahansa Yogananda. But wading through all of this, trying to really dive into the core essence of tuning into the vibrations of Lahiri Mahasaya. That is the objective of this class, not just to hear interesting stories of miracles or, quotes that you have not heard before, but more importantly, trying to feel into the living presence of who he was. Because I think all of our gurus had a very specific role, and we celebrate Guru Day each year in Ananda Palo Alto, where we walk through meditating on through the 5 shrines in our community, tuning into each one of them and meditating on each one of them and their particular message and teaching. And Lahiri Mahasaya certainly had a very, very significant role. However, his was also a very unique role because of all the different gurus, I think he was the person that was meant to actually usher in a completely new understanding of spirituality. And all the three themes that came to me that we will use to navigate this class and share this week and the next 2 weeks are actually not just themes that are universally spiritual, but things that Lahiri Mahasaya was particularly bringing in during his lifetime because he was trying to shift the whole planetary understanding of spirituality into a newer dimension. And before I keep talking about it, the three themes that we will be addressing, or rather discussing under for these 3 weeks, the first one is inner religion versus outer form. What religion really is, because religion throughout history, whatever documented history we have, has always been defined through form and structure and belief and scripture and all of that. And Lahiri Mahasaya, specifically in his teachings, was strongly trying to move away from that definition of religion always being one of practice and experience. And that was a core principle of his teaching. The second one, the idea of renunciation, of being a householder. He was demonstrating again that renunciation is not about form. How do you be part of the world and yet not of it? That image that Bhagavad Gita presents of the water droplet on a lotus leaf, how do you actually live that? Again, throughout history, east or west, the forms of renunciation that have been presented to us are all about form and structure, whether it's monasteries, whether it's wearing saffron and going into the Himalayan caves, whatever it may be. And Lahiri Mahasaya was bringing in a new teaching and ushering a new age where the understanding of renunciation was not based on form. And the third is meditation as the ultimate solution for everything. Again, something that we almost understand as the essence of our teachings and of yoga and all of the Eastern teachings today. But in Lahiri Mahasaya's time, that was not as obvious. Again, he was presenting a dimension of spiritual life and a way of leading it and a way of practicing spirituality that was completely, I wouldn't say new, but a newer expression of how he was guiding this planet, how he was guiding this age. So throughout these 3 weeks, I'm hoping to touch upon these three aspects of his teachings. The primary focus will be on what he taught, and sometimes looking at stories, looking at accounts from his disciples and direct quotes of Lahiri Mahasaya, but also tuning into this essence of how this guru, as I was sitting with it just today, it came to me that all these three, which the structure came to me many weeks ago when I had even proposed this class and I was planning for it. But it did not occur to me that these were all revolutionary. All these three ideas that he was presenting, and this was the cornerstone of his teachings. This was the entire definition of all that he did. The purpose of his life was to establish these three precepts of how religion is always an inward practice. It is not about outward form. Renunciation is also about attitude, and it's not about the external circumstances of your life. And meditation is central to everything. You cannot realize God except in your own spinal system. So all these three teachings are revolutionary, and Lahiri Mahasaya was the harbinger of that new age. Everything that came after that came from his own sharing of all of this. And I'm sure many of you have heard of this also. He was the first. This biography starts by mentioning that Lahiri Mahasaya was the first self-realized soul. Perhaps, I'm sure he is. I mean, who can really document or say these things? Who was able to document all of his own spiritual experiences and progress in very detailed journals. And Lahiri Mahasaya actually wrote these journals. He wrote it in Bengali script, but he wrote it in Hindi language. Nobody has ever written anything like that because Hindi and Bengali have different scripts. It's like writing, I don't know, English in Arabic script or something like that. But he did write in Hindi, but he was writing in Bengali script. In a sense, he was preserving his own experiences and his journals for ages to come. Some of it has been translated in these books. I mean, as exciting as it sounds, I have to tell you, it's not always something that you can work with. It's very philosophical, esoteric, and I don't know how much of it we'll actually share in these classes. And they have not been published in their entirety. There are said to be 26 journals of Lahiri Mahasaya's meditative experiences. They're also very visual. He illustrated a lot of these journals. You can go online, and Paddy is in the class right now. If you have any doubts, you can also ask him. There are a lot of resources online of many different digital versions of Lahiri Mahasaya's original sketches, journal. Anyway, there are a lot of things which I won't get into because most of it is beyond my understanding. But all of this is available to us in a way almost as if it's meant for the future, because we have barely touched upon a lot of what Lahiri taught. And his own life was so understated. He did not have a large public role. I mean, as all of you know, he was an accountant with the military engineering department. He actually completed his service and had a normal retirement, and then he received a pension, and he lived off of that pension. And he lived in this tiny, tiny little home in a very narrow street in Varanasi, and people just came to him from everywhere. And for decades, after he met Babaji and he came back to Varanasi, for some years he was active. But after his retirement especially, nobody ever knew of him leaving that room. People have spotted him, seen him in many, many different places. But especially after he retired from service, he did not move from his room. I don't even think he went to a different corner of the house. And, these things, that's what I meant by very understated. I don't think he ate. I don't think he never slept. He never laid down. Throughout night, he would just sit in lotus position, just meditating, and disciples would come, disciples would go. Disciples came to him even at 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. in the morning, and people would just walk in and out of that house. He never laid down to sleep. And so he lived a very, very unusual life. And for the most part, you can only imagine that it was his own wish, because obviously we are not just talking about saints, we are talking about avatars who are one with God. It was his own wish to keep himself at that low a profile, to not be creating a big scene in this world, because the time was not yet there. The world was not yet in that position for him to have a broad public presence or to bring this message widely as it can be done now, as many of us are talking here in this room right now. Anyway, today we will be exploring the first theme of the inner versus outer religion, of religion not being one of form. But even before I go there, just to go through some of the basics, because the historical context is fairly interesting, and I'll just share some details, which again, many of you, I'm assuming, are familiar through the autobiography of a yogi. Lahiri Mahasaya was born in the year 1828. And this book gives a lot more information on his parents, his lineage, and all of that. His father's name was Gaur Mohan, his mother's name was Muktakashi. And he was born in a very small village, and it is said that he was always drawn to meditation. He just sat in lotus posture on the riverbed, and he covered himself in sand, and he went into deep meditation, obviously, because of past samskars or experiences from past life. At the age of 5, there was a huge deluge where he lived in Bengal, and his entire family moved to Varanasi. And they also moved to Varanasi because his father was a Brahmin. He was actually a priest. And he was a very learned scholar. He knew many languages. So he wanted Lahiri to have a high quality of education. So their primary purpose of moving to Varanasi was so that Lahiri would get high quality of education. By education, I don't just mean a college degree or something like that. I mean education in the scriptures. So Lahiri actually knew many languages. This book says he knew 6 or 7 languages. He knew English, he knew French. For some reason, French was actually very popular at that time. Yukteswar Giri was also very proficient in French. So, and Sanskrit, Bengali, Hindi, and the Indian languages that were common at that time. So Lahiri was actually multilingual. And as we all know the story, I think as soon as, even before he became an adult, he was married to Kashi Muni, and she herself was also from a very spiritual family. That was Lahiri's wife. And he had 5 children, all of this before the age of 33, which is when he met Mahavatar Babaji. He met Babaji in the year 1861. So he was, as I'm going to share the story that I'm sure all of us already know, he was posted to this remote Himalayan town called Ranikhet. And he was transferred there, and he wandered into the mountains, and then he meets Babaji there, and the rest is history. All of this happened in the summer of 1861. And then he came back. He came back, obviously, not just as a reformed or a transformed being, but somebody who had awakened to his own true potential, because all of his memories from past life and who he was as present with him now as ever before. So now he could share all these blessings and the true depth of his own spirituality with the world. Again, as the autobiography of a yogi says, I forgot the exact words, the flower of Kriya wafting its gentle fragrance from this nondescript location, Benares, that was drawing devotees from everywhere. He obviously didn't do any marketing. He didn't have to promote or publish anything. He never wrote a book. He never formed an organization. In fact, he was opposed to most of these things. He did advise his disciples to actually start works of their own. So often when people say Lahiri was against organization, I'm not quite sure what he exactly said or didn't say. But even historically looking at it, Yukteswar Giri formed what is called Sadhu Satsanga, what later became his Satsang Society, which even has a letterhead that you see today. All of that was formed when Lahiri Mahasaya was in his body. And so it is only fair to assume that Lahiri himself was opposed to him doing those things or things being done in his name, but he did not stop his disciples from actually having established religious works. This is often an argument presented even against Yogananda's work, because they say Lahiri didn't want anybody to start an ashram. Lahiri was completely against institutions and ashrams. Perhaps he was in his life for himself, but I don't think he was strongly condemning, or at least it seems like he might have even encouraged a lot of his disciples to start ashrams and also write books. There are many disciples that he asked to write books in his name, and he said, I will be guiding you. I'll be writing through you. So he did not write any books of his own, but even the Arya Mission Gita commentary, which Master makes references to in the initial part of Autobiography of a Yogi, was written by one of Lahiri's disciples. Lahiri Mahasaya was writing through him. So that was his life. I have to say, so much of what is presented in the autobiography about Lahiri Mahasaya has, we get this, not just this Christ-like image of a great sage, but also one who's so transcendental. He always performs miracles. I was also thinking, as I was reading the autobiography of a yogi today, Lahiri Mahasaya has the highest miracle count in the book. There are so many miracles attributed to Lahiri Mahasaya that I don't think anybody even comes close. Obviously, the book has a lot of miracles, but Lahiri probably has 10 or 15 at least, if not more. So our window into Lahiri Mahasaya is so much about, his completely all transcendental nature if we go through the AY. And even as they say in the in page 8 of Autobiography of a Yogi, he materializes in the wheat field. He appears to Bhagavati Charan Ghosh, who was Yogananda's father. He was not allowing one of his employees to go meet Lahiri Mahasaya, so he speaks to Yogananda's father in the middle of a wheat field. And there are many, many stories shared. My favorite one, which is just as a personal tangent, what drew me to Autobiography of a Yogi, I was first exposed to it, quite honestly, at age 11, but not because I was spiritually inspired or somehow I was seeking in that way. Perhaps I was, but not consciously. But because somebody told me one of Lahiri Mahasaya's miracles, told me about one of his miracles where Gangadhar Babu, he is one of his disciples, he always wanted to take a photograph of Lahiri Mahasaya. But Lahiri Mahasaya would always choose to not appear on a photo. So you take a picture of a chair and the chair is just there, but there is no person there. So finally he agrees, and then the photo comes out. And so somebody shared the story with me, and I was so curious to read more. And that's what, for the first time, propelled me to find this book and to actually read it, although I didn't until I was 21 or 22. But, we read all of these miracles about Lahiri Mahasaya, and they're all helpful for us to tune into his compassion, his own stature. And then we also hear his teachings of Kriya, of all the things that I was mentioning, which is what we will try to focus on in these next 3 weeks. One other thing I'll also mention, which I thought was very relevant as I was meditating on this particular subject and course, is one of Lahiri Mahasaya's past lives. So in the Autobiography of a Yogi, Yogananda mentions at least 2 known past lives of Lahiri Mahasaya. One of them is his Raja Janaka, who was the father of the princess Sita, who marries Rama during the time of Ramayana. So he says Lahiri Mahasaya was Raja Janaka. And then the other past life of Lahiri Mahasaya that Master mentions in the Autobiography is the poet Saint Kabir. Now, Kabir is a contemporary figure. And I wanted to talk about Kabir also because this theme that we are exploring this evening of inner versus outer religion, it actually played out a lot more dramatically in Lahiri Mahasaya's life, but when he was Kabir. And of course, Lahiri Mahasaya also talks a lot about it. But I want to talk a little bit about Kabir, and maybe that example will come up even more as we explore the other 2 subjects as well, because the parallels are unmistakable. It is one thing that Master mentions it, but also you read the life of Kabir, you read stories from his life, you cannot but wonder, especially when you read Kabir's own writings. When he talks about breath and a lot of his teachings, they are almost verbatim. I'm not just talking philosophically, they're word by word identical to a lot of what Lahiri Mahasaya writes in his journals. So, in fact, I would say Kabir's poems are sometimes more accessible than Lahiri Mahasaya's writings. So, if you're interested, you can find English translations of Kabir's poem. In fact, one of the most famous translations of Kabir's poem was written by Tagore. So Tagore himself was very inspired by Kabir, and the book is very popular. I don't know what the name of the book is, but, Bijak? No, what is the name of Tagore's English commentary on Kabir's poems? Anyway, I don't even know if the book has a name, but it was written at least 100 years ago, I think now. Tagore translated a lot of Kabir's original poems into English. So anyway, coming to the life of Kabir, Kabir was a poet saint who again lived in Varanasi in the 14th century AD. So Kabir was a very, very interesting man. So Kabir was born to a Muslim mother. He was a weaver by profession. In that time in India, things not just in caste, even in religion and the socio-economic setting was such that everything was defined by profession. So weaving was something only Muslims did. Don't ask me why, I have no idea. But in Varanasi, it had a very ancient tradition of weaving, and that was done by the Muslim. It was even the quarters were separate, where they lived and all of that. So Kabir was born to a Muslim mother in the weaver's quarters as a weaver. So he was a weaver throughout his life. And a lot of his poems also have metaphors and imagery related to weaving. And he hears about this great saint named Ramananda, who lived in Varanasi at that time. He was a Hindu saint. And Kabir, who was a spiritual seeker, a young man, he was convinced that he needed a guru. And that, after searching far and wide, he has come to this conclusion that this Saint Ramananda was meant to be his guru. But Kabir was a Muslim and this guru was a Hindu. So this guru had an ashram and a whole Indian Hindu setup through which he was teaching. So he was, I don't quite know the details, and all of this, some of it is folklore, some of it is history. I don't know how to separate all of this out. But the way the story is told is Kabir was too hesitant, or the people wouldn't allow him to approach the guru in the ashram. So he actually laid down on the ghats of Varanasi in early morning at 4 a.m. when he knew that this guru was going to come take a dip. And nobody generally lays down on the steps because obviously it's a hazard. And so Kabir just laid down on one of the steps leading up to the Ganges early in the morning, and for the guru's feet to touch him. And he would consider that his initiation. So at 4 a.m. in the morning, he's just laying there, and the guru walks by, and as expected, the guru just steps on him without knowing that there was a man lying there, and immediately the guru just gets shocked, and he says, Ram. And Kabir takes that, has this mantra, and that touch as his initiation. And from then on, he goes into his spiritual practice, and his whole life, coming to the topic of discussion, his whole life was one that did not defy any of the religious structures or forms, but neither conformed with any of those. And that is how Lahiri Mahasaya also lived. He did not defy religion. There are many stories and quotes that I'll read as we discuss the subject of how Lahiri Mahasaya really approached religion. But he did not conform to any existing boundaries or structures. And Kabir did not either. So Muslims were drawn to Kabir, Hindus were drawn to Kabir. Kabir did not teach any outward practice. We don't exactly know what he taught. Obviously, this was 600, 700 years ago now, so we don't quite know the details of what all Kabir might have taught, but it's very clear from his writings that he was teaching something that had to do with breath, because he talks a lot about breath. And, we even say breath, but, even language and words like these obviously shift over time. He was talking about prana, so he was talking of a technique such as Kriya. So that's what Kabir was also teaching, but there isn't a living tradition that comes today from Kabir, so we don't have the exact details of what was being taught or how he approached all of this. But Kabir's life was one that never conformed to the existing animosity. So this was the time, remember, there was a lot of animosity between the two faith groups, because India was being ruled by Muslim rulers. And the Muslim rulers were decidedly anti-Hindu. And it was a very unusual time. The Indian culture is one that does not, that always absorbs and welcomes. It does not resist. It always integrates. So it doesn't, like Swami says in many of his talks, there is no either or in Indian culture. It's always an and. So the Indian culture just absorbs. So the culture, welcomes the influence of Islam, but at the same time, there is a lot of tension. There are many, many dramatic stories, and we wouldn't go into all of that in this particular context, of how the Muslim rulers tried to, there were even genocide of Brahmins in many parts of northern India, thousands. And because the Muslim rulers really wanted to eradicate Brahmins who were holding on to the religious structures, they wanted to take the wealth from the temples, because at that time in India, the kings were not the most powerful. The temples were the most powerful. The temples had all the wealth, not the kings. Kings come and go, temples stay. So temples had all the wealth, and obviously all the temples were plundered, and there was just a lot of tension between the two religions, between the people living in different parts of the city. So Kabir was a peacemaker in that sense. And I'll just share this one story of Kabir before moving on to Lahiri Mahasaya. When Kabir dies, this is a story that is very famously told all over India in many traditions. Again, I don't know how historically, I'm sure it is historically accurate, because the imagery is so vivid and you see signs of it everywhere where Kabir is worshipped. So when Kabir dies, everybody starts fighting over him, because the Muslims, they have to bury the body, and the Hindus, they have to burn the body. So now, what do they do with Kabir's body? He had disciples and he had followers from both religions. So they keep fighting and fighting and fighting, and the body is covered in a cloth. That's how the body is kept in those days. And then They fight and fight and fight, and somebody says, go look at the body, and then we can decide. And then they open, and it is just rose flowers. There is no body there. So Kabir's body just disappears into the ether. And as the story is told, they actually split the flowers into two. And they actually built both a mosque and a temple in that site. That site is still there. You can go visit it in India. It's not in Varanasi. He left his body in a different town. But you can still go and see that place. And so anywhere where there is a memorial or something in Kabir's honor, you always see this place. Sometimes even in platforms built on his honor, they would just spread rose flowers there because that's who he became. So now, moving on to Lahiri Mahasaya, I'll just read a few quotes and I'll also share some stories. This is from the autobiography of Yogi. Lahiri Mahasaya obviously also, he had no religious distinctions. He had disciples from both Hinduism and Islam. I mean, he would have had Christian or Jewish or other disciples. They just were not living in Varanasi at that time because it didn't make any difference to him. I'll just read a few lines from the autobiography and perhaps from this book, and we'll discuss more. A significant feature of Lahiri Mahasaya's life was his gift of Kriya initiation to those of every faith. Not Hindus only, but Muslims and Christians were among his foremost disciples. Monists and dualists, those of all faiths or of no faith, were impartially received and instructed by the universal Guru. One of his highly advanced chelas was Abdul Ghaffar Khan, a Mohammedan, a Muslim that is. It shows great courage on the part of Lahiri Mahasaya that although a high-caste Brahmin, he tried his utmost to dissolve the rigid caste bigotry of his time. Those from every walk of life found shelter under the Master's omnipresent wings. Like all God-inspired prophets, Lahiri Mahasaya gave new hope to the outcasts and the downtrodden of society. Now, to give you an idea of what this really means, because, of course, now we are talking in 2023 when you see the pictures of Yogananda visiting the southern parts of the United States with the dark-skinned people that live there, we don't quite understand how revolutionary that was during Master's time. So when you're reading about something that happened in 1870 in Varanasi, it might not be easy for us to comprehend how out of the norm it was. There's one story, it almost has an anticlimactic ending that I was reading today from this book about Panchanan Bhattacharya. Panchanan Bhattacharya was, one might say, he was the foremost disciple of Lahiri who actually spent the most time with him. And he also lived with Lahiri Mahasaya for the most part of Lahiri's life. And then, of course, he had his disciples and all of that. So one day, Panchanan Bhattacharya he took a dip in the Ganges. He was walking on the Ghats and he was coming out of the river. And he sees this spiritual person, somebody with this very, very elevated spiritual aura. And the author says Panchanan Bhattacharya had this unique ability to be able to see the light in people. He could easily see somebody's karma and how spiritually evolved they were. And so this person could see this other man that he saw at a distance was very, very spiritually advanced. And then immediately he was just surprised because I didn't know that such a man existed in Varanasi, in exactly where I live. So he starts chasing this man. And as he does, there is a thought in his mind, why am I chasing somebody who's not my guru? What is wrong with me? And then he immediately feels guilty for having pursued somebody else for their spiritual stature while he had Lahiri Mahasaya waiting for him. So he comes back home, and the first question Lahiri Mahasaya asked Panchanan Bhattacharya, so you couldn't catch him, could you? And Panchanan Bhattacharya obviously knew that Lahiri knew every thought and action of his, and he starts weeping. I don't know why I did that. It was so instinctive for me. I would never pursue anybody other than you. I don't know why I wanted to run behind this man. And then Lahiri comforts him and says, don't worry, he's actually a disciple of mine. He is your Guru Bhai, you've just not met him yet. And then Panchanan is surprised, but why do I not know him? And then Lahiri says, because he's Muslim. He doesn't want to come when all of you that are Hindu are with me. So he comes at other times. And Panchanan says, oh, that's okay, I understand. Now that I've had this experience, now I know that I don't need to pursue anybody that is not you. And whatever desire I had for meeting this man and to be in his presence has already dissolved. I don't hold it in my heart anymore. And this is the anticlimactic part of the story. And Lahiri goes on to say, that's great. He doesn't want to meet any of you either. And that's it. The story ends. So, I mean, it is just illustrative of the religious tensions that existed, that, it is not actually as common for people of different faiths to mix in that way or to share teachings or to practice together. Another story that is told is if, he obviously had a lot of disciples that were Brahmins. And there was this other famous lawyer who became a disciple of Lahiri Mahasaya, and he was spiritually very advanced. And all of these Brahmins, they would feel uncomfortable because this lawyer, who was actually from a lower caste, although he was professionally accomplished, was sitting in the same place as them, that they were sharing seats. And so they had this judgment in their mind for many weeks or many days. And Lahiri Mahasaya once, one of the evening satsangs, he says, he asked this man, his name was Jaiswal. He says, Jaiswal, you don't have to sit there. Come sit next to me here. So again, I mean, obviously there was no resistance except that everybody in the audience that were of a higher caste, they all felt bad, how judgmental they were for having had those thoughts. So, it's one thing to overcome prejudice and race, but Lahiri Mahasaya was also just presenting an example at a time when the world itself was very, very divisive. The other part, though, now this is the interesting part of Lahiri's teaching. This Yogananda mentions in the autobiography of a yogi too, but I want to talk about this a little bit more because especially in our culture, when I say our culture, in the Western culture in the United States, this aspect of being equal is often overlooked. I'll read these lines from the autobiography. A Muslim should perform these are Lahiri Mahasaya's words. A Muslim should perform his namaz, worship, 4 times a day. 4 times daily, a Hindu should sit in meditation. A Christian should go down on his knee 4 times daily, praying to God and then reading the Bible. It is an interesting, I'm sure many of you have read these lines from the autobiography of a yogi. This is what I meant when I said Lahiri Mahasaya did not conform to religious boundaries, but he did not defy them. He did not intend to dissolve them. And that is a very important distinction for us to actually think about. In fact, in that same context, I'll read a few more words to give it more context. Master says, the great Guru encouraged his various students to adhere to the good traditional discipline of their own faith, stressing the all-inclusive nature of Kriya as a practical technique for liberation. Lahiri Mahasaya then gave his chelas liberty to express their lives in conformance with environment and upbringing. Now, it is sort of an unusual teaching, especially in the United States, because even though there's a lot of tradition and culture in this country, it doesn't go as far back as Europe or India or other parts of the world. So it is not that you're conforming to something that's been a tradition in your family for 28 generations. It's probably from your grandparents at the most. So it is different applied in the Western context. But the other part that he's underlining is we often talk about, again, I'll mention this as well because they're not mutually exclusive. We often talk about how external ritual is not an antidote to delusion, how this path of Kriya and the path of meditation does not place any emphasis on external forms or how they are not seen as a route to salvation. But Lahiri Mahasaya never diminished them. And that is an important point for all of us to note. He was saying he wants Muslims. In fact, what is understated there, again, which is explained even better in this book, he actually wouldn't give Kriya to Muslims if they didn't do namaz 4 times a day. Because that was an essential part of their faith and practice. So you're not replacing, you're not, exchanging this t-shirt with another. You have to really outgrow the costume that you were given in order to deserve or to benefit from a costume that's bigger and better. So, the path of Kriya is not a defiance of traditional faith. It's not a defiance of religious forms. It's a transcendence of religious form. And that subtlety, indifference was an important teaching of Lahiri Mahasaya. There is a very interesting story. Paddy shared this with me once, and then I was reading this book again these past couple of weeks, and I read this story multiple times because it's such an interesting story. Every Sunday, Lahiri Mahasaya had this tradition of visiting this very ancient temple in Benares called Batuk Bhairav. And anybody who goes to Varanasi, you're supposed to go to this temple. It's a very tricky temple to visit because it's very crowded, not very hygienic. It's not an easy place to navigate. But that's besides the point. But Lahiri Mahasaya went there every Sunday. If you think it's only in the last 50 years, it's not. Varanasi was always like that, even 200 years ago. Some people think Varanasi has become dirty and chaotic only because of overpopulation or overcrowding in the last 100 years. Actually, it's not true. It's always been very chaotic and difficult to navigate. So Lahiri Mahasaya went to Batuk Bhairav temple every Sunday morning, and one of his disciples asked him when he came back home from his temple visit, "You are God yourself. Why do you make it a point to go to this temple every Sunday?" And Lahiri just calmly looked at him and asked, "If I don't go, will you go?" And that's it. He moved on. He didn't even say you should go. He just said, "If I don't go, will you go?" Meaning to say that Lahiri had a lot of respect also for traditional practices, because Kriya was always an aspect of spiritual life that emphasized a certain form of maturity in your own spiritual expansion. And in order to use a key as sacred and as powerful as Kriya, one needed to have their own journey in terms of developing their devotion and developing, perhaps in most cases, even having an external form of devotion. Because that's what purifies the heart. There is, in fact, another story. I'll read this story. I'll perhaps read it from the book, because I hope I can find this page. I have so many bookmarks here. Let's see. Give me a moment here. I hope I can find this. Okay, I did. I'm going to read the story. I've been talking for a while. It's a very interesting story. Bhutnath Sen, an engineer and disbeliever in idol worship, was employed in Assam. Here he had heard the name of this household yogi, Lahiri Mahasaya. Bhutnath was immensely eager to learn about Indian Yoga Shastras and had studied a number of spiritual texts. Eventually, he understood that by reading the text, the true essence of religion cannot be known. He visited many sannyasins, renunciates in that region, but they failed to satisfy him. It seemed as though that Bhutnath was interested in knowing and deriving something more. Therefore, one day he arrived at Varanasi and presented himself before Lahiri Mahasaya. The moment Bhutnath completed paying his obeisance, Lahiri Mahasaya inquired, "You have come to Varanasi. Have you taken a holy dip in the Ganges and visited Lord Vishwanath?" Vishwanath is the form of Shiva that exists in Varanasi. Bhutnath, being a non-icono-dualist, replied, I don't even know what that means. That's what the book says. "I have not come to pay a visit to Shiva's idol, but to pay a visit to the living Vishwanath that is in front of me." Referring to Lahiri Mahasaya, "I did not come to see a stone idol, I came to see you." And Lahiri Mahasaya stated, "You do not have the correct knowledge in this regard. You first go take a holy dip in the Ganges and pay darshan to Vishwanath, and then you can come here." After the holy dip in Ganges, Bhutnath went to the Vishwanath temple, and while he was rendering homage to the idol there, he saw the idol of Lahiri Mahasaya in that place. He immediately realized his mistake. Lahiri Mahasaya would, in this manner, ask everyone to abide by the prevalent practices of their times. He would say, "Until settlement through Atma Karma is achieved, it is better to abide by prevalent practices." The next day, Bhutnath again appeared before Lahiri Mahasaya. Lahiri was smiling. Bhutnath paid his homage and sat down. Lahiri uttered a few essential truths to Bhutnath and imparted advice under the guise of a story. Bhutnath was quietly listening to these till now. When Lahiri Mahasaya halted, Bhutnath expressed with folded hands, "Whatever I had required to know, I had jotted that down on a piece of paper, lest I forget, and I kept it in my pocket. It was my wish that I would learn about them one by one. But all this time you were answering to these questions of mine, I do not any longer need to know anything. I have received all my answers already. So, it is a very instructive story, but also, it brings our attention to an often overlooked part of religion, which is religion is not meaningless. Religion has a very significant role in shaping the direction of our consciousness. And once, as he uses the book uses a lot of metaphors and words that are sometimes hard to understand. I don't quite follow every word that is being used and in what context. But as he says, until there is settlement in your own consciousness, you have to practice external practices. All that is the essence of these teachings, because we all may not still be holding on to whatever traditions we were born with, or whatever church one went to when they were 5 years old. But the real instructive teaching here is external practices are both necessary and meaningful until one has attained settlement of consciousness. There's one other place, I don't know if I can find this, where Lahiri Mahasaya in his own words explains this quite a bit. He explains this, I'm not sure I can find it because I don't have my notes on what page number it is. So there is, the other part of looking beyond caste boundaries and religious boundaries is also, this understanding of spirituality itself as an inner reality. And that is, again, something that seems so obvious today. But in the time when Lahiri Mahasaya lived, again, when the world itself was so bound by tradition, a certain person was considered more spiritually evolved. A certain profession was considered more spiritually elevated. A certain person was not. There's a story, again, in this book. The author shares a story of a very old Brahmin man who had performed so many rituals, who had been very pious, devoted, very noble throughout his life. And he had been wanting Kriya for a very, very long time, and he had been wanting to come see Lahiri Mahasaya. So he makes this arduous trek after his retirement, after he ends his job, to come meet Lahiri Mahasaya to ask for Kriya. And he goes to Lahiri Mahasaya and says, I've come because I'm very desirous of having the Kriya technique. I have no other priorities except these practices in my life right now. And Lahiri Mahasaya says, you're not ready yet. You have to continue these practices for some more time. Why don't you go back and come to me after some time? And the same day, a very old woman approaches Lahiri Mahasaya, and she had no spiritual upbringing. She had none of these practices. She did not know anything. As soon as she walked into the house, Lahiri Mahasaya says, I would like to give you Kriya right now. And the disciples that were sitting, watching all of this, asked Lahiri Mahasaya, can you explain to us, why did you not give Kriya to that man? And Lahiri's answer was very interesting. It was not because, again, that is the thing with Kriya itself. I mean, for everybody sitting here, we have all received Kriya initiation, and perhaps most of you watching online also. It is not that Kriya is kept secretive in order to protect the technique. It's not that there are these hoops to jump through or prove your loyalty or sincerity or devotion before you can learn the technique. It is more about whether a technique such as that would be helpful where one is spiritually. Because if it's not, taking that initiation or taking the technique would not spiritually benefit. And more than anything, it might diminish your own perception of value in the technique. And it can actually not be a positive thing on the longer cycle of many, many incarnations, because one has to treat and acknowledge these techniques and these teachings with the level of sacredness and seriousness that they deserve. That's the only reason, there's a process for people to learn Kriya, and it's not just that they walk into a room and they can watch a video or get a book to learn it. Now, Lahiri goes on to explain this man needs to do a little more work. He will be ready and he will get Kriya, but he said, although he has had this great good karma in this life to be doing all these spiritual practices, it is all new to him. Whereas this other lady who walked later on in the day, she had many, many lifetimes as a yogi. And so she was already there in order to benefit from a technique like that. So, when these masters gave Kriya, obviously it was not based on, whether you have completed the required classes or how much sadhana you do in a day. They could easily see through one's own past spiritual karma, where they were at. And even just with that blessing, they could significantly shift their consciousness. So in that way, Lahiri was not just breaking the norms of religion, but also he was introducing a practice and a way of tuning into spirituality that had less and less to do with external form. It didn't matter what caste or what religion or what background one came from, but it did matter how mature they were spiritually, what practices did they do, how sincere they were, how dedicated they were, whether they were committed enough, and all of those things did matter. In fact, that's the other part. A lot of times when people try to defy religion in a way that, presenting universal precepts or, talking of spirituality in just broader general terms without grounding it in a tradition or in a practice, oftentimes such points of views are not actually grounded in practice or experience. It's more philosophical, or it's an idea. Whereas Lahiri was the opposite. In fact, again, I don't know if I can find this particular quote. I wish I'd bookmarked better. Well, he goes on to talk about how important it is, the discipline of practice, how important it is for one to commit to keep practicing every day, and how that practice is the definition of one's own religion. Without that, there is no definition to one's spirituality. I mean, we all know this because when you learn Kriya Yoga, you obviously take a vow saying that you're going to practice it twice a day for the rest of your life. And it's not an ordinary vow, because that becomes the definition of your spiritual life. If you want to call yourself a Kriya Yogi, what does that label come with? What is that definition that we are taking on? It simply reflects a certain commitment to a practice. And so much, there are so many graphic stories here. I'm digressing a little bit, but I'll come back to where I was. Because so much of how we make progress, as we already all know, those of us sitting in the room, is not actually through a technique. It is through the grace of that guru. It is through the guru's intervention. And somebody like Lahiri Mahasaya, somebody like Yogananda, whether a living guru or one who has already transcended the body, they come to us through this practice, through our own loyalty to follow their instruction to the word. And that's what gives them the power to help us. Even if they wanted to help us, without our commitment to the practice, they are limited. They cannot, that grace cannot come to us until we have given our 100%. So, there are so many graphic stories in this book of one. I'm going to share the story as it's told in the book, so just bear with me here. So there's a doctor who once goes to Lahiri Mahasaya, and he says, this is an actual doctor who's treating a patient, and maybe, I don't remember the exact details, maybe this was somebody who was close to him, like a spouse or a child or something, asking Lahiri Mahasaya, this person might die, how can I treat? I have no idea how to treat this person. I've heard that you often give medicines to people. And Lahiri Mahasaya often gave things, even in the autobiography, there are many stories, which I'm sure you're familiar with, to heal people. Whether it's an oil to drink or this or that, he gave many things. And Lahiri Mahasaya, if I'm right, he says, take this very, very fragrant rose water. And he says, this is the rose water I'm going to give you. And this is very fragrant, this is very special, this is the best rose water you can get. And he says, now mix in this your stool. And you have to give that as the medicine to this person. I know, it's a very graphic story. And that's what the doctor does. And the person is healed. And, I wonder, I was reading that story. Clearly, the point of the story is to almost dramatically illustrate the point that it is not in the medicine. But the power is not just something Lahiri Mahasaya made up. The power, just as the Bible states, when the hemorrhaging woman holds on to Jesus' robes and Jesus says, your faith healed you. It is, that statement has so many dimensions and such depth because that faith heals. And the disciple has to demonstrate their attunement, their loyalty, their commitment. And without that demonstration, even the power of a self-realized guru cannot help you. So, as disturbing as that story is, I feel like it illustrates that simple point that when the disciple was able to demonstrate unflinching loyalty to Lahiri Mahasaya, the disciple already had the power to heal. And so, anyway, I was saying all of this because where was I? Why did I go into that story? Because the technique itself is not where the power resides. And oftentimes, the devotion to practicing the technique is not just because, I don't mean to minimize it, but it is the truth. It is not just because one round of Kriya is one year of right living or any of those interesting numbers and concepts we read in the autobiography of a yogi. They're all true. But at the same time, it is important to practice Kriya, because if we don't, Master cannot help us. So in a sense, the loyalty to the technique itself is a channel through which the Guru can come and help us. I'm saying all of this because these are all relevant to the topic that we are discussing between outer form and inner religion, because in some way, this kind of a loyalty to a practice and a technique itself is a structure or a form. So it is not that we are defying all forms to just sort of say everything is God, I am God, you are God, let's all be God. It's not that. There is still a grounded understanding of spiritual practice, of your own loyalty and commitment that is reflecting in your practices and your understanding and how you execute all of that in your life. And that is essential to how the Guru can help us. The grace of the Guru cannot otherwise be channeled in our lives without that loyalty and commitment. So let's see. Anybody has any thoughts to share? I have two. I don't know where I was planning to share this, but I have two other interesting quotes which I will share right now. But if anybody has anything to share in the meantime, because it's going to be a non sequitur, that's why I'm saying that. So if you have anything else to share, you're very welcome to. Yeah, go ahead, Paddy. You can tell, and then I'll repeat it on the microphone for the recording and people watching on Zoom.
This is a story of Lahiri being a householder. So
yeah.
Wife asked him to get some groceries.
Uh-huh.
Very mundane job, right? Like imagine Lahiri with a basket going for grocery shopping, along with a servant. So both are getting groceries because hey, you need to get it. And suddenly, Lahiri Mahasaya tells this servant, I'm going to be hurt very soon. It's my karma coming in. So get a piece of cloth ready. So as expected, something scrapes in, but some cycle goes by. We don't know exactly, but Lahiri Mahasaya is bleeding, and as expected, he has the cloth ready. He ties it. So the servant asks, Master, if you already knew that you would be going to be hurt, can't you prevent it in the first place? And Lahiri Mahasaya goes, yeah, but you have to take, karma works in weird ways. You have to take the hit, minimize it, and then that's a great story in itself. And then they knock on the door, and immediately his wife opens and says, "What happened?" Because she sees. Oh, the servant narrates the story, and he goes like, "Yeah, but you tied it on the wrong leg. This leg was bleeding. It was right." It was a very, very fun story because it also means you think of in the world but not of the world. Like, he really doesn't see the pain. He really knows what is coming, but he really goes through the action. So
Yeah.
It was a fun story.
I'll repeat it for the sake of the recording. Paddy was just sharing a story again. I think it's from this book, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so when Lahiri goes to get groceries, he tells one of his disciples, I'm going to get hurt, so I need a piece of cloth you will need to tie on my leg because something's going to happen to my legs. And then, it happens, and the disciple ties the cloth, and then the disciple asks an obvious question. If you knew you were going to get hurt, why could you just not get hurt? And then Lahiri just says, you have to go through the karma that you have to go through. And they go home, and his wife opens the door. And then immediately the wife notices and says, you actually tied the cloth on the wrong leg. Even the act of tying the cloth did not matter, but who knows what karmic calculation was being balanced in what way. It's just so beyond us. I'm going to just read this interesting quote from the book. There are a few quotes I'll just read now because I thought they were interesting. These are words of Lahiri Mahasaya. There is no dearth of skeleton-like matas, missions, and ashrams. These are all names for spiritual institutions in the spiritual world of India. Establishment of matas, missions, etc. does not entail practice, for these act as a deterrent in practice, as then the objective is centered on the further expansion of the institution and the missions. Therefore, Lahiri laid much importance on practice, on sadhana to be practiced in seclusion. He would state that by donning saffron robes, people can distinguish a person as an ascetic, and this impedes sadhana. By donning ordinary attire, recognition is absent and sadhana can be well practiced. The life of renunciates is an extremely difficult one, therefore, he never consented to any of his devotees becoming, when he says sannyasi here, he's talking about a formal vow of renunciation. So, we'll talk more about this next week, but again, it is an interesting, I thought it's worth mentioning because some of these words have been taken too far. There are traditions of Lahiri Mahasaya where, he did recommend disciples meditate in seclusion and not form institutions and ashrams because of obvious reasons, because you don't want to focus on the external form. But then, some people have taken it too far, saying that you cannot meditate in the presence of somebody, or you cannot sit with another meditator and meditate, or, just how these things happen with spiritual teachings, just over time, how they get misconstrued in ways that are not how a realized master would have meant it. Now, we have no way to say in what way Lahiri meant it. So our only lens and perspective on all of this is based on what Master taught and what we hear from Swami in terms of how Master taught. So it is important for us that I'm not giving an interpretation of Lahiri Maharsh's teaching just based on what makes sense to me, but I'm saying this with confidence only because Yogananda asked us to meditate in group. Swami Kriyananda always encouraged us to meditate in group and also meditate in seclusion. Because as long as we are able to keep the focus on the practice and not get carried away in the form, that's the essence of what Lahiri Mahasaya was talking about. Now, this is just a very interesting story. I don't know what to say, so I'll just read this. It doesn't fall into any category. Again, I hope I can find this. Well, I'm not able to find. Well, I'll just tell the story. I think it's this one. Anyway, I'll just tell the story because when I read this today, I've read this before, but it was so interesting that it's not necessarily about inner or outer religion, although in a way it could be. So Lahiri Mahasaya always required a donation for Kriya initiation. And for some reason, I think it was 5 rupees it was the normal fee, but then when somebody was a widow or something like that, then it has to be 10 rupees. But there was an actual standard fee when he gave Kriya, and people had to pay it in order to take Kriya. There was no negotiation there. And obviously, if they didn't have the money, it was not like he was not going to initiate them in Kriya. He would loan them the money. And then over time, they had to repay the loan back to him because they needed to put that 5 rupee bill in the bowl when they took Kriya. That was not an option. And later on, as this kept on happening, there was a wealthy devotee, one of his disciples. He actually created a fund. So when poor devotees came to take Kriya, they could go get 5 rupees from him and go to Lahiri Mahasaya if they were approved for Kriya, and they could take Kriya. And this is the interesting part of the story. Lahiri never used or touched that money. It was always kept separate. He never combined it with any of his money. And this is what the book says. The money was never meant for Lahiri Mahasaya. It was a fee that he paid to Babaji. And Babaji would send a representative every so often to collect the money from that box. And whatever was collected went to Babaji. Now, where Babaji lived, even today, there is not much of an economy or shopping needs. So I don't quite know, but in a way, this story and this example also ties back to our topic of discussion, because sometimes we misinterpret this whole idea of not needing a form in odd ways. We think it's not about not having a form. It's about always working with the spirit. So you cannot get more formal than that. It's just like, unless you give 5 rupees, I'm not going to give you Kriya, and then I'm going to put it in this box, and there's an agent that comes every year on this day to collect that fee, and it goes to the headquarters, or, it all seems so strange. But in this odd way, here Lahiri Mahasaya was, especially as this author recounts his stories. I mean, it is only fair and also understandable that Lahiri Mahasaya was God. And when you read the stories, when you see how disciples related to him, it is not any different from how one relates to Rama or Krishna in the Indian tradition. Jesus in the Christian theology is a little more rigid. It's not as there are a lot of theoretical concepts that come into how these things are defined. But in Indian tradition, it doesn't exist. If you're God, you're God. Just like that exchange between Master and Devi Mukherjee. If you're one with God, you're God. So Lahiri Mahasaya was God, and then the story also, in an interesting way, illustrates how he himself had this loyalty to somebody, and that his loyalty was unquestioning. And in another place, he even talks about this book makes a lot of references to all the different meetings Lahiri Mahasaya had and with Babaji. And then he says, Babaji, he never met Babaji in the later years of his life. He was always in communion with Babaji. He says, the author says some story which I couldn't fully understand. And then in the next paragraph, he says, this goes to prove that Lahiri Mahasaya never met Babaji in physical form in the last many decades of his life because he didn't need to. He never had to, because before then, there were a lot of times he would call on Babaji, he would get messages from Babaji, all of that was much more common. But later on in his life, he was one with Babaji. He didn't need to see Mahavatar Babaji in the form or need to have him visit his own home. But still, how humbling to even think about his loyalty and how he looked up to Babaji and this whole 5 rupee, 10 rupee thing. I was just reading that story and I just couldn't get over that. Any other thoughts about Lahiri Mahasaya? I have one last quote. Chidambar?
Yeah, we got to go to Varanasi. It was 88 when we got to see him. Right? Maybe 86. One of those years they wouldn't let us into his house. And so the femme wouldn't let us in. So we had to stand at the door, 2 at a time, and pray while the rest of the people talked to the relatives to keep them out of the way. And standing there, you could just feel Lahiri's power just come right over you. It was just like there was a wind blowing your hair, your head, and everything. It was like truly phenomenal. So that's Lahiri for me.
Chidambar was just sharing his story of first visiting Varanasi and visiting Lahiri Mahasaya's home. I think back then, he was saying 1986 or 88 or whenever that was, you could actually go into Lahiri Mahasaya's home. It was still open. Now it is open only one day in a year on Guru Purnima. And then he was talking about how I think you couldn't meditate there because, again, you have to meditate in seclusion. So you could just walk inside and pray. And some of the people in the group had to distract whoever was there so that they could meditate briefly. And he was just describing how he could just feel his vibration emanating and coming out of that home. Just, all of us, even today, whenever I've never been inside the house, but I walked past the street and the door many times. It's also, whenever I'm there, it is almost so strange and surreal because it's dirty, crowded, chaotic. And you also feel like, when you go to Satyalok, which is the current Lahiri residence, there is a space to meditate. But obviously, the home where Lahiri Mahasaya himself lived, there you cannot enter. It is still interesting to think about how God lived here. And still, it is still the same. The same experience you have when you go to Babaji's cave in Ranikhet. We were just there last year, and many of us are going to go in a month's time. You go, you walk in the mountains, and you're in this cave. There is there are some steps, and there is some concrete that's been done to protect the cave and to have a lock and key. But really, nothing is different from 1861. It is pretty much the same as it was in 1861. And here, Mahavatar Babaji met Lahiri Mahasaya and he gave Kriya for the first time. It is just fascinating to even think about that. It almost makes me think that sometimes all of us are living in a parallel dimension. If the rest of the world just comprehended for a moment that God lived in this house in Varanasi, this was the place from where these blessings were just being broadcast to the whole planet. I feel like everybody would be walking the streets differently, or there will be a different kind of reverence, and in a way it's almost perfect because it doesn't need to be any different, and for all of us to just simply know it on our own hearts. There are so many temples, and I'm planning to be in India in the later part of October, and I'm planning to visit a temple of Lahiri Mahasaya. And then I've been hearing more and more, there are so many temples of Lahiri Mahasaya in India, that are being built in Bengal right now. Some of these temples are like 4 times the size of this church, and they're just a spectacle to even behold. And it is just interesting to think about how nondescript and how understated his whole life was. And he just intended for it to be that way. And all of us, I feel like, are particularly lucky because we've somehow recognized it, and we are all here discussing and tuning into his presence this evening. Because it's not an ordinary life, and that was not an ordinary mission that he came into this world with. And, you cannot help but wonder someday all those 26 diaries that he wrote, that he illustrated, people often talk about how precious they are, how great it'll be when they're out, but I read some of the quotes from those diaries and I'm like, the world is not ready. And I'm not ready. I have no idea what this means. I mean, it all sounds good, but I don't know what to do with that. He just talks about, appears the star, and this is the blue within the blue. And, he's just talking about experiences that are not yet part of my meditation, that are not yet part of my reality. So it is not that I would be able to do much with it, but still, that vibration is emanating. And we are tuning into that, in a very powerful way. And everything that we do, and Lahiri Mahasaya, just that story from the autobiography when Master had cholera, and, the light came out of the picture and healed him. You just have no idea how much of his presence can still flow through a picture, or what is emanating from that doorway in Varanasi, or, we go to, I've been to the Shashwamedh Ghat, which is a very famous place in Varanasi, not very far from where Lahiri lived. And, I used to think, when I first went there when I was 10 years old, that's now late 90s, and now I've been there many times since then. And 10 years ago when I was there, when I'd read the autobiography of a yogi, I thought, this place is so chaotic. And it's probably 25, 30 times more unbearable and chaotic today than it was even 10 years ago. This is the exact spot where the stone moved, and Mataji and Baba, came from under the rocks. Mataji still meditates there. And you just look at it and wonder, why did they choose that? What is happening here? What is it in Varanasi? Lahiri lived there in the 14th century, and then his family moves there again in this incarnation. You just don't know how all of these things come together. And there are lots of poems of Kabir that next week, I was so busy reading these books today. Next week, I'll perhaps bring a few more translations of Kabir's poem to share with all of you. They're just so poetic, and they're very, very interesting, and just each one of them is a piece that you can meditate on. A lot of them are about breath, they're about death, they're about finding God, and some of them are all about the spiritual eye and the experiences you have in meditation. They're almost exactly the same as what Lahiri Mahasaya shared, but it's just all in the form of poetry. There is one quote that I want to read before we finish, if I can find it. If not, it'll have to wait till next week. I didn't do a great job of actually bookmarking. Just give me a minute here. I'm going to try and find this quote. That will be a perfect closing for our evening. I think I'm going to share that quote next week, so you can all come back. But I'll read from the autobiography of a yogi before we close the evening. So let's all just take a moment to close our eyes and just sit still. In taking all of these discussions, but more importantly, taking the feeling of our hearts, feeling devotion, gratitude for the life of Lahiri Mahasaya, asking for his blessings to fill our lives. I'll read these words from the autobiography of a yogi. Again, words of Lahiri Mahasaya. He only is wise who devotes himself to realizing, not reading only, the ancient scriptures. Solve all your problems through meditation. Exchange unprofitable religious speculations for actual God contact. Clear your mind of dogmatic theological debris. Let in the fresh healing waters of direct perception. Attune yourself to the active inner guidance. The divine voice has the answer to every dilemma of life. Though man's ingenuity for getting himself into trouble appears to be endless, the infinite succor is no less resourceful. Let's sit with those words just for a few seconds. Again, visualizing Lahiri Mahasaya and mentally bowing at his feet. Om. Peace. Thank you all for joining us. We can end the Zoom meeting now.